what do we think about when we think of those words revolution and repression? They frequently seem to go together. Well, today we have 4 eminent people coming to address us. Sitting directly to my right is Michael Kirby, who of course is a past Justice of the High Court of Australia. He's had a long service in the law, 1975 to 2009, and of course he's held a number of posts, both domestic and international, including with the UN, the Commonwealth, and other international positions. Most recently, he's been the chair of the United Nations Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry into the human rights violations in North Korea, which reported earlier this year. Sitting to Michael Kirby's right is Frank de Cutter. Frank is the author, most recently, of The Tragedy of Liberation, a history of the Chinese Revolution from 1945 to 1957, which was shortlisted for the George Orwell Prize. His previous book, which was a fascinating account of Mao's Great Famine, won the 2011 Samuel Johnson Prize for non-fiction. Frank's books have really changed the way, certainly, I view modern China, and I know many others do as well. He's not popular in a lot of circles, but I think you'll find what he has to say absolutely enthralling. He's currently he's the Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong, and he's kindly been supported by the Dutch Foundation for Literature. And to Frank's right, you see, I've done it this way because it makes it easy. I just have to say right. We have Zhang Jinsung. Now, Zhang Jinsung is, you wouldn't imagine there'd be a job of a state laureate, a poet in North Korea. But his job was to pose as a poet from South Korea who was looking at the North from the South and completely in its thrall, praising it as if he was some outsider looking in on this hermit kingdom and being in complete admiration. And that was his role in life. But then he saw some things that made him ask questions, and that is where his story began. Mr. Zhang defected from North Korea in 2004. He is the author of an incredible book called Dear Leader, which represents a tiny fragment of the knowledge that he has about North Korea. And sitting to Mr. Zhang's right is Shirley Lee, who is equally incredible. She is the person that translated the book into English, so that all of us could also hear that tiny fragment of information. We can imagine how much more he has. And Shirley's work is largely about making a lot of that information known to the rest of the world, and she continues to do that. She read classics and Persian at Oxford. She's translated the poetry of Chinese poets since the Cultural Revolution, and we're really delighted to have both of them and, of course, Frank and Michael Kirby here with us today. Please welcome them. So I thought to start the conversation today, I would like to perhaps throw the first question to Frank de Cutter, because I suppose when we think about the Chinese Communist Revolution, we know a lot about it, or at least we think we do, because the Chinese Communist Party is still in power, even though it's barely communist by its earlier definitions. So my first question to Frank de Cutter is, what does the communist revolution, what does what you discovered in your research, in your book, The Tragedy of Liberation, tell us about the people who are in power today?
It's a very tricky question. Violence, repression seems somehow to be very much opposed to the notion of a revolution. Revolution is about justice, it's about equity, it's about creating peace out of a military situation like the Civil War in China. I think Simon Schama said it a long time ago in a book about the French Revolution. He said that violence was the revolution, and that made him very unpopular with historians in France and the French reading public. And equally, in my own book, what I discovered is that the foundation of the Chinese Revolution, the very heart of it, is not so much a moral mandate or popular support, but broken promises, systematic violence, and calculated terror. The early years of the regime in China, after the red flag goes up, opposite the Forbidden City in Beijing in 1949, are pretty tough years. That they are best described as one of the worst tyrannies of the 20th century. I think that seems to some readers to constitute a clash. Surely in the 1950s there must have been a golden age. Surely before Mao's great famine that caused tens of millions to vanish, beaten, worked, starved to death. Surely before the Cultural Revolution that starts in 1966, there must have been something good at the very heart of that revolution. And the beauty of the archives is that it now shows us that those years were brutal in the same sense that Simon Schama found this about the French Revolution in 1789. Not to mention Lenin, of course. And most revolutionaries are quite clear about this. They do say right away that violence is necessary. The very word that Stalin picked for his own name, Stalin, means steel, the man of steel who will crush all enemies of the revolution. Molotov, his first hand, is called Molotov because it means a hammer to smash the heads of the bourgeoisie. Mao Zedong discovers violence in the countryside in 1927. He sees it as the tool, the one way to bring about regime change, is violence from below. And then again, when you think about it, it's not entirely surprising. When you say revolution, there must be something else called counter-revolution. And in the beginning, there are counter-revolutionaries who threaten the regime. Bolshevik in 1917, Chinese in 1949. But before you know it, these regimes become paranoid, afraid of their own shadow. They see enemies everywhere, spies lurking behind granaries that go up in flames, agents from Taiwan who poison wells. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. These regimes start creating counter-revolutionaries through the very violence that they apply. They create more violence. It becomes a cycle of violence. In the case of the People's Republic, some of the victims of land reform in 1949, those who were executed, their assets distributed to the poor, their families are visited again, frequently by the same perpetrators 15 years later during the Cultural Revolution. Because, of course, the neighbors who profited from the house, the assets, the lands of those liquidated by the regime in 1949 are afraid that their sons and daughters might come back to claim that house and that land. In Daoxian County, some 10,000 farmers are pushed off cliffs during the Cultural Revolution by other farmers. Entire families wiped out. It all goes back to that founding act of 1949, of revolution. So what does it tell us about the regime today? I escaped that question because I don't really spend much time studying the politics of contemporary China. I'm a historian. But it must be crystal clear that in the case of China and in the case of Korea, I think as Mr. Jung so beautifully demonstrates, the very families, forget about individuals, these are families who run these places, have accumulated so many privileges and so much wealth that they're not about to start sharing it with anybody else. I think in Michael Kirby's report, buried in a paragraph, it says somewhere that the current dear leader in Korea last year alone spent $645 million on luxury goods, from leather bags to electronics and cars, I presume. Of course, the wealth of those families in charge next door in the People's Republic amounts to billions and billions. These are families that were there from the very beginning. The father of Xi Jinping, Xi Zhongxun, was a founding member and played a crucial role after 1949. The father of Guo Xilai, the man who was put on trial recently, was a man called Guo Yibo, Minister of Finance. He's the one who, like a good accountant, added up the number of people killed during the campaign of repression from October 1950 to October 1951. He's the one who produced the figure of 2 million people liquidated during that one single year. These families stretch the entire history of the People's Republic.
Mr. Zhang, you were in the regime that a lot of people, when they think of, I suppose, repression, revolution, tyranny, think of today. Did you see evidence, first-hand evidence of tyranny and repression?
우리가 알고 있는 상식적인 북한은 권력 독재 그것만 알고 있는데 사실은 북한인 권력
Do you want to clear the Korean?
Is it
Do
possible?
you want simultaneous?
Pardon?
You want simultaneous?
Simultaneous,
Okay.
definitely, yeah.
하면서 한다고. 그럼 나한테 말해요. 내가 번역할게.
If you want.
No, he can talk to me and then I'll translate.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
북한이 권력 독재만을 이야기하는데 사실은 북한은 권력 독재와 함께 감성 독재.
Because most people, when they think of like dictatorship or totalitarian systems, they think of physical force and physical oppression and physical forms of control and enforcement and restraint.
이 주민들의 정서, 감성, 심지어 언어의 것까지도 다 실용주의로 유도하는 이 감성 독재에 의해서 저체제가 유지되고 있습니다.
But in North Korea, the physical force is not the first tool of oppression. It's actually the emotional control mechanisms. For example, from birth, even from birth, your language, your mind, your worldview, like there is no literature in North Korea apart from the supreme leader's literature. It's the emotional totalitarian system that sustains the physical oppression.
그 감성 독재의 지배가 얼마나 지독한데 대해서 제가 한 가지 사례를 들어
So I'll give you an
말씀드리겠습니다.
example of how insidious this emotional totalitarianism is.
혹시 여러분들은 영어를 아십니까?
Do you guys speak English?
제가 왜 이렇게 물어보냐면 사람의 모든 감성, 시련, 기다림, 희망, 행복 이런 감정들은 바로 언어에서부터 시작이 돼요.
And I asked that obvious question because you wouldn't understand me saying it in Korean, but you would when it was translated. And as that shows, it is language that makes sense. That it expresses your world. Everything starts with the words on the page or in there.
내가 어렸을 때 배웠던 감정, 언어를 통해서 받은 감정, 그것은 뭐였냐면 바로 수령에 대한 충성과 반대로 적에 대한 중호, 이 두 가지 감정에 해당되는 언어들만 배웠습니다.
And since birth, since growing up in school, in the family, the only two emotions that we had words for, literally, was love, which was exclusively for the supreme leader, and hatred of the foreign enemy.
개인이 모든 권리, 이런 것들은 수령의 권리를 위해서 이렇게 수령 이기주의를 위해서 이렇게 감성 독재를 통해 집중이 됩니다.
So the way power works in North Korea, the way oppression works in North Korea, is every individual's language, the building blocks of communication, it's hijacked in order to justify the absolute monopoly of power by the supreme leader from birth.
북한이란 나라를 숫자 셋으로 설명을 할 수가 있어요.
He's saying, I like to look at North Korea through the number 3,
3대 세습,
third generation of tyranny.
3대 멸족 연자제.
The guilt by association reaches 3 families. Your 3 generations of one family member gets condemned for one person's crime.
3대 세습은 수령이 지금 할아버지 때부터 손주 때까지 하고 있는 거고 3대 멸족 연자제는 죄를 범했을 경우 할아버지가 죄를 범했을 경우 아무 이유 없이 손주까지 끌고 가는 북한 주민들이 인간성을 이렇게 인질로 묶어놓는 바로 이런 악법입니다.
So by the three-generation tyranny from Kim Il-sung to his grandson Kim Jong-un. Guilt by association for 3 generations. If a grandfather commits a crime considered political, his grandson, who may be 2 years old, doesn't even know of the world yet, he gets condemned by the same crime. In this way, what keeps North Korea going is that your most valuable, like your most precious form of humanity, which is to love and take care of your loved ones, the ones you feel most responsibility for in your lives. Basically, you are tied, like you are put in a chain gang. So if you jump off the cliff, you're basically pushing your wife and kids off the cliff with you. That is what keeps you loyal to the regime, because you don't want to kill your own wife. So in order to stay humane in North Korea, you have to be inhuman to others.
나치는 자기 민족을 가두는 수용소를 두지 않았어요. 북한은 자기 민족을 학살하는 정치범 수용소를 운영하는 이런 악덕한 시스템임에도 불구하고 왜 반란이 일어나지 않냐? 바로 이 3대 멸족 연좌제를 통해서 북한 주민들이 인간성을 이렇게 묶어놓기 때문입니다.
He's saying the Nazi regime justified its atrocities by saying, oh, they're another people, they're not our race. In North Korea, it is your own family members, not just your race, but your own blood that you are made to condemn by the system. But why, when it's so much more systematically? So if the Nazi regime was about the other, in North Korea it's about betraying your closest. That's what the system encourages. But why is there no revolution in North Korea? Because your closest ones are held hostage by it.
바로 이런 시스템이기 때문에 또 다른 사람이 있는데 그것이 바로 94년부터 99년 사이에 300만 대량 아사가 발생한 것입니다.
And the third three is between 94 and 97, 3 million people died of starvation.
가장 가난한 나라에 가장 부유한 왕이 살고 있어요.
Because North Korea may be the most impoverished nation in the world, but it has the most wealthy leader in the world, not just in terms of wealth, but he can have anything he wants, and the people have to give up everything they want.
이런 감성 덕제를 깨자면 제가 북한에 있을 때는 북한 주민들이 우매해서 정권이 강해서인 줄 알았는데 제가 외부에 나와서 보니까 자유 세계가 변화되지 않기 때문에 북한이 변화가 안 되는 겁니다.
So when I lived in North Korea, I was frustrated for a long time. A lot of us in the elite, we all know what is wrong with the system. We don't need our hearts and minds open. We know exactly what is wrong with the system, but we can't act because all our families are held hostage. So when I was in North Korea, I thought we couldn't change because the system was too powerful. But when I escaped, I realized it was not because the system was so strong. It was because the free world did not understand why we could not move forward.
제가 마지막으로 이 말씀 드리겠습니다.
Last thing to add.
감성 덕제를 제가 왜 이야기했냐면 호주 마이클 커비 지금 그 위원장 북한 인권위원회가 만들어졌는데 사실은 이 존재만으로도 북한 주민들이 감성 덕제에 그 세뇌된 북한 주민들이 의식을 흔드는 핵폭탄이나 마찬가지입니다. 왜냐하면 수령이 세계 최고라고 선전하는 북한에서 그 바깥 세상에서 이러한 인권 상황, 독재 상황은 규탄하는 이런 인권위원회가 만들어졌다는 것만으로도 북한 주민들에게는 커다란 쇼킹이라고.
And he's saying the emotional totalitarianism, the emotional oppression of North Korea. When Michael Kirby did his UNCOI human rights report, he's saying that is so amazing. Like the North Korean people are so amazingly grateful for that. He knows because until now there has been absolutely no ground for consensus that this is even true. People dismissed it was true. People thought, oh, we can't verify it. It's not really happening. Because the supreme leader is so morally righteous, and even the outside world respects its sovereignty and legitimacy. So no one is on the North Korean people's side. But by showing that these things actually exist and that the international community does acknowledge that these things are actually going on and it's real and it's not made up, that is like the biggest weapon against the emotional totalitarianism, because North Korean people know that this is happening outside. So it's like, oh, our supreme leader is not morally righteous. They finally have reason enough to believe their doubts that actually the supreme leader is not so morally righteous after all.
Thank you very much. That was extremely powerful. We're so glad you're here to inform us all. Michael Kirby, what did sitting as chair of that inquiry do to your own understanding of tyranny and repression?
Well, of course, I came to that issue, from the background of an Australian. And we are one of the few people on earth who have never had a revolution. We are the beneficiaries of the English revolutions, and in particular the revolution where Parliament prevailed over King Charles, cut off his head, and the revolution of 1688 where Parliament prevailed over James II and insisted that parliamentary law would be observed. So the goodies won in the two revolutions that we inherited, and we're also the beneficiary of the American Revolution, because after the American Revolution the British were extremely careful, at least with settler societies, and so we can't so easily get our heads around this type of tyrannous situation. But North Korea tried to frustrate the inquiry by the United Nations. They have been brilliant in their diplomacy over the last 60 years in sailing under the radar of the world's attention, but their refusal to allow us to come in, despite the urgings of the Human Rights Council, didn't stop us. We undertook our public hearings in Seoul, in Tokyo, London and Washington DC. We had no problem getting witnesses. And the witnesses spoke in a rather similar way to Mr. Jiang. They, not as poetically, but very low key. When I was in Washington DC, I went to the Holocaust Museum, and there's a wonderful exhibition there at the moment called Neighbours, and I was reminded of that by what Frank said. Photographs of neighbours looking down on the Jewish victims being rounded up in the street with looks on their face of anticipation of how they could move quickly into their apartments and seize all their property. Neighbours, ordinary people, do horrible things. But these people came along and told their stories in much the same way as the video film of the Holocaust victims in Holocaust museums tell their story, as if this is just a sort of ordinary course of events. The horror and terror and fear of it all is just subsumed in explaining day to day the terrible things that happen, unmentionable, unpardonable, unthinkable experiences. And we recorded it. I think it was the result of the common law system. We hold our inquiries in public. The European civil law tradition tends to do it more efficiently, behind closed doors, just gathering it quickly, and it's not quite as ceremonial and not quite as formal, but doing it in public has a great advantage. And we filled our report. Every second page has quotes from the witnesses telling their story. It's not mediated through us. It's the people telling their terrible, fearsome stories. And nobody in the world can now say they don't know about North Korea. Before, we sort of had Dennis Rodman type ideas and a chubby leader and all that sort of thing. Now there is no excuse to the world. It has a report from the United Nations which is readable, it tells the story, and in effect it does what Frank has done in the Chinese context. It's allowing archival processes to be expedited and people in the here and now to tell what they went through, and that is now before us, and the challenge is what we do about it. Last Thursday in the Security Council, a resolution was advanced which urged that the case of Syria be referred to the International Criminal Court, and 2 states used their veto to prevent it, 2 permanent members of the Security Council, namely the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. And there is a question as to whether they would do the same to our recommendation that the case of North Korea be referred to the International Criminal Court. And what happened this week is a somewhat gloomy eventuality. There are differences, of course. Russia is now very much disengaged from North Korea, And the People's Republic of China is, in a sense, itself directly threatened by the instability of a regime which can get rid of the second or third most powerful man in the land, Jiang Sung-tek, the uncle of the Supreme Leader, the brother-in-law of the dear leader, and the father-in-law of the great original, or the son-in-law of the great original leader, Kim Il-sung. So we have to hope that something will be done, and eventually something will be done. The death of Jiang Sung-tek is not business as usual. That is not business as usual. And so I think it's a matter of watching this space. I think things are going to occur that will uphold the international principle of human rights for the people of North Korea. And I would like to thank both of the authors whose books we're looking at now, which are so tremendously fascinating, for helping us Australians to understand this. It's very nice that you're here today, because today the older members of the audience will know it's Empire Day. It's Queen Victoria's birthday. And so we Australians, at least of the older generation, know that we just have no experience with revolution. And that has some good aspects, but it makes it harder for us to understand the unbearable suffering of the people of China and the people of Korea.
Thank you very much. You'll all be happy to know that I'm still on page 1 of my questions and I have another 10 to go. I hope you can all spare a few days. I will try and sort of pare down what I had been really hoping to ask this amazing panel. So I'm going to sort of skim through, but also if you could keep your answers fairly brief so we can get a few more issues in. Frank de Cutter mentioned in a discussion yesterday, a really good question from the audience came about, was it just the person at the top who makes the terror, creates the tyranny? And Frank mentioned the idea of mini Maos, i.e. Mao Zedongs, as opposed to little mice with big ears. I wonder, is this is something that occurred in China, obviously. I also want to ask the other two participants about North Korea, but can you talk about this? Why are there so many so-called willing executioners?
It's not. I don't think it's particular to the People's Republic or to Northern Korea. It's the very essence of a dictatorship. That there is one dictator, and the way to get ahead in that system is to imitate the dictator and just try to outdo all the others who are trying to get closer to the dictator by being even rougher, showing your revolutionary determination, fulfilling that plan, that quota, that mandate, or that latest directive, whether it is about killing counter-revolutionaries or producing grain or having more steel output. So I think this to me is the very difficult point about these dictatorships, that any one dictator is always surrounded by others who really make all of that possible. And then it triggers down all the way to the floor, so to speak, the ground, where local cadres vie to outdo each other. Where in fact, in the 1950s and 60s in the People's Republic, competition is seen to be part of the political system. That killing campaign I mentioned from October 50 that unfolds for a year, villages compare how many people they've killed with other villages, counties with counties, provinces with provinces. Some of these figures circulate among the leadership. You have to show that you're tough. But I guess you asked me for a short answer and I'm getting a little long, so let me make one more point. The real difficulty is when it comes to horrendous situations like Mao's Great Famine or the famine in Korea in the 1990s, when it is not just cadres who somehow benefit from the radical winds blowing from the capital. But ordinary people are compelled by the circumstances created by these regimes to do horrendous things to each other. Fathers stealing from their own children. Women who have to make a choice, which child do you feed, the boy or the girl? And there it becomes very much what Primo Levi in his memoirs about Auschwitz referred to as a gray zone. There's no longer white and black, party versus people, it becomes a gray zone, and that's a zone of sheer horror.
Michael Kirby, what are your observations about the phrase, it's never just the one?
Well, I agree with Frank. There is just sheer survival. A wonderful book on this is not before us, but it's Bis zum bitteren Ende, the war diaries of Victor Klemperer. And they explain how just surviving from day to day, particularly with food, how food, if you don't get food, it gnaws at you. You can survive a few hours and maybe a few days, but then it's totally obsessive. And getting food, I think, and surviving is part of the explanation. Example, we had so much evidence of school children being lined up in village squares to watch public executions in North Korea. This is the way it's brought home to the whole population, that you've got to be afraid, you've got to be careful. But during the famine in North Korea in the 1990s, that is one of the rare occasions where the people began to stand up because survival was even greater than fear. And the women began to put trestles in markets to sell food, and that was very useful. People were able to get some food off the ration system, and then the government tried to stamp that out, but then the women started to fight back, and the people started to support the women, and the government really backed out, and therefore the free market began to intrude, breaking down the government's control over the supply of food, which was a part of the control of people's conduct. Fear and food, I think they are really very important aspects of the Chinese story as I understood it from Frank's marvellous book, but also the Korean story as I understood it from Mr. Jiang's book and from our inquiry.
Jiang Jung-sung, I wonder what happened to you during the North Korean famine, and what was your experience of how others, perhaps who were less fortunate than you, experienced that?
저 이야기하기는 좀 혹시 부끄러운데요. 그때 고난의 행군 때 그 상황을 제가 조금 이렇게 설명을 드리도록 하겠습니다.
Going to explain the circumstances at the time.
그 시장에 가면
Can't hear me.
Maybe speak a little slower. I didn't hear that. I'm
Sorry. He says he's going to describe the situation at the time.
시장에 가면 그 여인들이 그 이불을 만들어 파는데 그 이불 섬은 담배꽁초를 줘서 그 필터 섬으로 그것을 모아서 만든 이불이었습니다.
So I went home to my hometown. 평양에서 살았다가 갔던 얘기를 해야 되잖아요. 얘가 평양에서 살았다가 갔더니 갑자기 본 거잖아요.
아니, 고난도 상황이 어쨌든 이해해.
아니 자기랑 비교해 달라는데. 그걸 평양에서 살다가 사령 갔다는 거 얘기해도 되냐고 내가.
I think we're having a little clarification going on here.
네, 그럼 제가 이야기할게요.
One thing you learn in courts is that translation is never a direct word-for-word thing. You've got to understand the context.
북한은 조선민주주의 인민공화국이 아니라 평양공화국입니다. 모든 혜택이 평양에 집중되어 있습니다.
North Korea's Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I mean, obviously it's not democratic or whatever, but actually it's none of those words. It's actually the Pyongyang Citizens Republic.
Pyongyang Residents Republic. 그러니까 그 평양 시민들 같은 경우에는 북한 지방 주민들하고는
We're just having trouble. If you could speak slowly when you're speaking, Shirley.
Me?
We're just having trouble catching you.
Okay.
Perhaps a bit louder.
Okay. Hello. 내가 안 들려.
다시 얘기해.
So, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's the official name of North Korea, but it's not democratic, obviously, but it's also not a people's republic. It's a Pyongyang Citizens Republic because all privileges get routed to Pyongyang when there's a shortage, and the borders of Pyongyang are really heavily fortified. You can't enter or leave at will.
그래서 평양에서 지방 현실에 대해서는 좀 이렇게 잘 알지는 못했었습니다.
So when he was there, especially when the famine started happening, and he lived in Pyongyang at the time, it was impossible to know what was going outside. There were rumors, but you don't know whether it's true or not.
그럴 수밖에 없는 이유가 북한의 언론은 정부 선동 언론이지 사실을 이렇게 말해주는 언론이 없고 인터넷도 없고.
There's no communications like internet, phone at the time especially, and there is no free press, there is no press, full stop. There's only government propaganda.
이동의 자유도 없습니다. 그러니까 평양에서 지방으로 가자면 무슨 비자를 떼서 가듯이 또 통행증이 있어야 됩니다.
And there's no freedom of movement. To move out of Pyongyang, it's more difficult than getting a visa to go to another country.
저 같은 경우에는 통전부에서 근무를 했었는데 대남 공작 부서였어요. 그러니까 남한으로부터 들어오는 대북 지원 물자들이 그 공급 물자 저희는 공급을 해줘서.
I worked in the United Front Department of the Korean Workers' Party. It's like a counterintelligence division and psychological warfare. And because there was no state rations anymore, but they need to keep feeding the party officials. So I received rations that were humanitarian aid. They all got rerouted to the party officials.
지금 이런 이야기 하기는 굉장히 부끄러웠어요.
Even now I feel really embarrassed to talk about it.
그래서 제가 그 지방에 갔을 때 저는 그 고향에 한번 내려갔었는데 그때 그 상황을 보고 굉장히 그 충격을 받았었습니다.
I was allowed to go home just after the famine, and I was shocked.
그 이불을 만들어서 파는데 그 이불은 담배꽁초 필터로 솜으로 만든 이불이었습니다.
There was a marketplace by the train station when I arrived, and it was just hawkers, really, not really a marketplace. And there were women selling blankets filled not with cotton or whatever, but filled with cigarette butt filters, used cigarette butt filters.
세수물, 집안에 가진 건 맹물밖에 없기 때문에 그것도 팔아야 되니까 세수물이라고 여인들이 팔고 있었습니다.
And they could not find anything to sell, so they would like sell a cup of water as if it was, basically they were so desperate. They owned absolutely nothing, so they were trying to figure out ways to make value out of things that didn't have value.
거리에는 시체들이 있었고요.
And there were corpses everywhere.
저는 그것을 보면서 살아있는 자신이 살인자 같았습니다.
And I really felt I was a mass murderer.
왜 이렇게 그 94년부터 99년 사이에 많이 죽었냐면 배급제에 의존하다가 그 배급제가 붕괴됐을 때 정권이 주민들에게 솔직해야죠. 쌀을 못 주니까 먹고 살아라. 그런데 이 체제 자존심을 위해서 계속 쌀을 준다 하고 계속 이렇게만 그 이야기했기 때문에 주민들은 앉아서 굶어 죽은 겁니다.
And why so many people died during the famine was not because they couldn't find food. Actually, it was because they believed the propaganda still. So many people died not looking for food, but because they were waiting for the next day's rations, because it was loyal to trust the regime, and it was like blasphemous to not trust the regime and try it on your own. So more people died waiting than looking.
30명이 굶어 죽었다면 쌀이 없어서 굶어 죽었다고 할 수 있지만은 그 많은 사람들이 굶어 죽은 것은 식량이 없어서 굶어 죽은 것이 아니라 인권이 없어서 굶어 죽은 겁니다. 시스템의 문제입니다.
He's saying if 30 people had died of hunger, that's a lack of food. When 3 million people die of hunger, it's not a lack of food. It's a lack of not knowing that they have a right to feed themselves. Because 그거 깨닫는 후에는 찾을 수 있었다고. 그건 말이 안 되니까. Finish there. So basically, it was the fault of the emotional totalitarian system that they did not know they do have a right to break the rules by trading in the markets and feeding themselves.
Sorry, I need to bring myself back to here. We could obviously go on and hear more of these incredible, moving, confronting stories. And of course, if you have questions in a few minutes, I'll finish on this question. We were discussing in the green room a little earlier what the knowledge that people like Mr. Zhang bring to the world, what inquiries like the one that was chaired by Michael Kirby bring to the world. Where do we go from here is my question. What is the solution? Is it to remove the leaders who commit these atrocities? How do we bring change to North Korea? And I want an answer from each of you in as brief a time as you can. Why don't we start with Mr. Zhang?
북한 정권과 주민을 분리시켜야 됩니다.
That the world has to begin to separate the system from its people in how they understand North Korea.
지금 외부 세계는 자꾸 북한 정권과 대화하고 교류하고 지원하는데 그것은 정권을 유지시켜주고 체제 주민들이 고통을 더 연장시켜주는 그런 결과밖에 안 됩니다.
The only things the world has tried until now is not to separate the system and the people, but to work through the system and therefore strengthen the ties between the people and the system.
북한에는 두 개의 계층이 있습니다. 하나는 배국 계층이고 다른 하나는 시장 계층인데 배국 계층은 정권에 충성하는 사람들이고 시장 계층은 주민들입니다.
You can look at it this way: there are two forces locked in battle within North Korea. One is the force that is the market force, is that feeds you. So you're loyal to money, to the black market, to trade, to free flow of information. The other force is the loyal force. You have to keep going, you have to remain loyal because you're going to kill your family if you don't do that.
북한이란 트럭은 고무바퀴로 굴러가는 나라가 아니라 그 네모나다가 억지로 성군 정치라는 계엄 통치에 의해서 억지로 굴러가는 체제입니다.
The North Korean system, the regime remains, not because it's sustainable. It's like it's not a round wheel, it's a square wheel. It's being forced to go. It doesn't have to go. It's not supposed to go. But they're pushing this square wheel.
북한 체제에 지금 북한 주민들이 들고 그 스스로 정권을 바꾸게 하자면 감성 독재를 깨야 됩니다.
He's saying the only way to break down the physical control mechanisms is to break down the emotional totalitarian system.
저는 그 유엔 그 한류를 좀 이야기를 해줘요.
So here's one concrete example. For example, there's a lot of kind of controversy right now about whether it's not right or right to broadcast into North Korea. Some people say, oh, let's respect North Korean laws and sovereignty. We can't infringe our Western values on them. Other people say, oh, we should go through the system. We should do English teaching or tourism or like open hearts and minds, engage business, education. And he's like, there have been a lot of changes in North Korea. People are more bold in protesting against the security officials. But he's saying, did this happen because Westerners went, because they saw Westerners coming and respecting the legitimacy of their supreme leader? No, it happened because everyone in North Korea has seen the outside world. And for example, North Korea's propaganda system has actually already been defeated by what's called the Korean wave, the South Korean soap operas, singers. It's actually technically still illegal 3-generation penalty to watch South Korean soap operas. But because everyone was doing it, it couldn't be enforced. So the penalty got reduced in de facto terms to single punishment. Even that could be enforced, and then it got reduced to labor camp. That couldn't be enforced because so many high-level people were doing it. So now there is effectively no penalty for watching South Korean soap opera. So basically, it is not people going on tour that eroded the control mechanism. It is the erosion of the emotional dictatorship that began to erode the physical control mechanisms.
물리적 압박만 생각하지 말고 심리적 압박, 주민들을 그리고 정권을 이 심리적 압박이 더 강합니다. 가령 예컨대 마이클 커비 위원장님께서 김정은은 아주 이 인권 전범자다 그렇게 이야기하면 북한 주민들은 왜? 정말? 이러이러한 범죄를 저질렀다. 이렇게 겉에서 이야기만 하셔도 그것이 주는 북한에 주는 그 심리적 타격은 어마어마한 것이에요.
He's saying in this way, the solution to North Korean freedom is not in physical means. That physical cannot combat emotional. You have to reach out to them to tell them you are right. What you have inside that you doubt because the regime tells you that it's blasphemous, it's actually right to think you're being oppressed. It's actually right to think you have a right to food, to information. Don't the outside world say, oh, we respect your leader. No, because that's not what they need to know. They need to have confirmation from the outside, oh, we do have a right to illegally access outside information. We do have a right not to be sent to prison camp for disobeying my party official. Like, maybe I'm right because other people are thinking the same.
북한엔 핵이 있다면 마이클 커비 위원장님에겐 진실의 입이 있습니다.
You think North Korea may have nuclear weapons, North Korea may have force, but Michael Kirby's UNCR report, truth is the stronger weapon against North Korea.
I'll ask Michael Kirby to go next, if that's okay. If you can keep on the same topic, you've created this landmark report. Where does it go?
Well, when we finished the report, it went to the Human Rights Council. The vote of the Human Rights Council was extremely strong. First of all, we had been set up without a vote. It was virtually unanimous that we should be established. So that was a step forward for the world community. Then when we produced our report, there was a strong affirming vote of 30 states in the Human Rights Council, and the only countries that voted against acceptance of the propositions in the report were China, the Russian Federation, Vietnam, Venezuela, Cuba, and Pakistan. They were the only countries that voted against it. When it went to the Security Council under the ARIA procedure a month later, there were 2 empty seats, China and the Russian Federation. But of the 13, the Security Council is 15, 13 turned up, so every other member turned up. Of the 13, 11 spoke, and of the 11, all of them were in favour of referral of the case to the International Criminal Court. That is the step that objectively would be the best immediate step of a body which is already existing that could immediately take up and consider whether a prosecution should be launched. And so that was the first principle we put forward. But I agree with Mr. Jiang. Truth will conquer totalitarian control. We must understand this is not just an autocratic country. The world is full of autocratic countries. This is a country which is totalitarian. Not content to control your body, they want to control your mind and your heart. The way to get around that is ultimately to bring the truth. North Korea does not have access, ordinary people don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to international media, they don't know about our report. But all of the members of the Soviet bloc, except the Russian Federation, the former Soviet bloc, voted in favour of our report. And so many of the ambassadors from those countries came up to us, and some of them said it in the open session. We know what you are talking about. Do not think you have wasted your time. Whatever happens here, you have recorded the story. You have affirmed the dignity and human rights. This is one case for all the failings where the United Nations has acted as it should act. It has set up the inquiry, it has gathered the reports, the highest officials of the United Nations support action. It is not action to get rid of the government of North Korea because they are a member state of the United Nations. We have no authority to supplant them. But what we have said to them quite clearly is, if you join this world organisation and if you sign on as you have to so many of the great treaties that have followed Eleanor Roosevelt's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then you must conform to it, and we will hold you accountable to it. So I don't see this matter going away. I think there is a very strong resolve in the world community, and those who vote against it and provide obstacles to it will be accountable to the people of the world, who are the foundation of the United Nations, and also to the pages of history. And one good thing has happened. Although the internet is not available, increasing numbers of young Koreans in the north are coming out of China with Chinese mobile phones. And the Chinese mobile phones have contact to the internet. And therefore that is spreading in that community, and the intranet, which is available in North Korea, is a way by which the control that the government has previously had over people moving even outside their village, they have to get authority to move. Now they can talk to each other across North Korea, and information and the work of the Commission of Inquiry cannot so easily be suppressed. And I think that will spread the news, and the news will be the news of liberty and equal rights, and I hope that that will be a contribution. In due course it will be. Let there be no doubt, it will be a contribution to a greater justice and freedom for the people of North Korea.
And I'm afraid we might have to skip the question session, because I'm very, very keen on hearing Frank's response. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party has changed. Chinese people have incredible amounts of freedom compared to 20, 30 years ago. So in this case, it would seem that a totalitarian regime can reform. Your views on this?
I was about to give you my solution to the North Korean.
Oh no, please do that as well.
I'll just wire it to the White House. I think that as a historian, which is always what must be so striking, is that these regimes, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic under good old Chairman Mao, and North Korea all along, project an image of strength and power. But what the past illustrates so clearly, including the archives from the Soviet Union and the period under Mao, is how weak and chaotic they actually are. Nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. Jasper Becker, wonderful journalist, has described the manner in which scholars have exaggerated the strength of the Soviet Union as one of the great scandals of the 20th century. And I always find it rather striking that some of us, as scholars, don't seem to quite believe that truth is a very powerful weapon, and will go to great lengths to somehow pussyfoot around the crimes against humanity committed and still being committed by some of these regimes. John Gray, the lead reviewer of the New Statesman, only yesterday reviewed a book on the history of the Little Red Book, to which 13 people have contributed. And one of the things he said in his review is that none of these contributors are willing to talk about the crimes against humanity committed by the author Mao Zedong. You could read the whole book and never realize that something bad happened in China between 1949 and the death of the good old man in 1976. So I agree with both Michael and Mr. Zhang. Truth is a powerful weapon, but surely one should have the courage to say it.
Thank you very
Truth
much.
and technology. Truth and technology. The technology of information has expanded so amazingly that I think we can have confidence that it's much harder to suppress now. You just can't keep people in their little village. The word will go out, and I think that is what we have to hope. And when I go to South Korea at the end of next week, that is what I'm going to explore. How do we get this report? How do we get the truth into North Korea? That is the urgent priority, I think, and I won't let up until we get it in there.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to see today's panel on revolution and repression. These three incredible authors will be signing copies of their books in the Glee Books area. If you do have any quick questions for them, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to answer them there. Sorry we ran out of time, but thanks very much for coming today.
You sign my